All right. Welcome to the collective. If you're joining us, this is the Creative Finance Collective. We're here just to talk about the real estate market, real estate law, creative financing. We got a few attorneys here to discuss and may have a few more that log in as we go. I'm Andy Fowler. I know we've got Drew Jenkins here in out of Georgia and Alabama, and Elizabeth Best in Scottsdale, and Jeff Watson out of Ohio. Jeff, can you hear us? Well, Jeff, if you can hear us, your sound isn't coming through. You might want to try logging back in. Um, Drew, we were just talking about what you're kind of seeing in the market generally. I know you're a closing guy and a transactional guy, so you don't like to get your hands dirty in the litigation. And our offices work together a good bit. But what um, give us an idea what you're seeing out there. You're saying you're seeing a lot of litigation or a lot of disputes over real estate, or over some of these, real estate matters?
Yes, compared to like in years past, right? Most things were generally pretty smooth. But basically, ever since the market kind of started going sideways, everyone entered a lull once rates went up. But the market's kind of coming back, but it's changed quite a bit. Obviously, there's a lot of new guys in the space, right? Especially people that are watching like Pace and them, and they're beginning to get their feet wet in the market. But there's a lot of folks that are entering it that just they're not operating in good faith, and they'll get properties under contract and then their buyer will get a property under contract. So that's really what we're seeing these days compared to in the past is we're seeing a lot more like daisy chaining. So it used to be you would have, normal assignments or double closings, but now it's just what I was saying. We had a file that was like an A, B, B, C, C, D, E, F. And, once you have that many people trying to get a slice of the pie, the odds of something going horribly, terribly wrong are pretty high. And so we're just dealing with a lot of sort of the middlemen kind of going after each other, I guess, or trying to play dirty with each other. Another thing that I haven't had to deal with in the past generally, but I'm seeing a lot more, is sellers are entering into multiple contracts. And I think a lot of it has to do with the whole DocuSign thing. And we just have a lot of sellers trying to double sell. And these days, compared to in the past, I think in Arizona, it's a lot more common that people file memorandums of contract. Or in Georgia, we generally call them notice of settlement. We have a statutory form for it. And we're seeing a lot more people file these. And so that's how we know that, hey, Mr. Seller, I know you've signed another contract with this other firm, and that obviously also causes quite a bit of issues. So yeah, I've been sending a lot of things over your guys' way because you said I just don't handle litigation. End of story.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, we had Brian. Brian was on the collective, and for those who are watching, Brian is an Arizona attorney and Georgia attorney, working outside of his Georgia office. And he was talking about a lot of the litigation they were going through. And one of the things he was saying is some of these matters that we're seeing, and I don't know if this is Georgia or Arizona specific with regard to this, but we used to be able to resolve a lot of those disputes with a kind of a quick demand letter and a threat. And that was getting harder to do, that he mentioned more recently. Some of that had to do with the market shift and other things, but it was taking a little bit more grease uh, to get through some of this. And a lot of that had to do with, which was interesting, he said, the doctrine, a lot of lawyers kinda trying to push back, we're using, like, the doctrine of latches and things like that, have the idea that you either let certain remedies that you have sit or didn't pursue them, or, because some of these what some of these folks used to do that would just record memorandums is they just go record them. 'Em. They'd think they locked up a property, they just record it and, like, forget about it, never do anything about it until it became an issue. But, yeah, I've heard that there's been an increased level of litigation, um, so on and so forth. Uh, Jeff, I know you tried to log back on. Can you hear us? If you can hear us, we can't hear you. So you might have an issue about whether, or you might look at your sound settings. That may be a possible, one. So Drew, are you still seeing, since the last time we discussed in Georgia and Alabama, are you still seeing closings at the same rate you were seeing before? What does that look like with the market doing what it's been
They've
doing?
actually picked up. I think people are just sort of getting used to how the market's a little bit different. At least for our particular firm, we're actually seeing an uptick in the amount of sort of the creative finance and investing space. And I think it's just because people are getting used to it, or at least for some segments of the market, as rates go up, cash is always king. But especially if you have an investor that comes in with cash and doesn't need to borrow, they're able to get a pretty sweet deal on it. And so I think that's also, I think there's two reasons that we're seeing sort of the daisy chaining we didn't see in the past. Is one is the fact that their margins are getting a little bit fatter than they used to be, right? Because again, I think people are just sort of getting used to the rate. The other reason I think we're seeing it is I think during the downturn, some people really sort of specialized in sort of their lead generation. So they're really good at getting sellers under contract, but they were not spending their time during the doldrums on cultivating their buyers list. Whereas other people in the market, they kind of let the sellers go by the wayside and really began to began to cultivate a buyers list. And so now you're seeing them have to link up because the people that used to have all the buyers are not the same people that also are able to generate the sellers. So there's kind of been almost a bifurcation in the market, or at least that's kind of what I'm feeling because we're dealing with some of these same parties. And the only reason they're in it is they have all the buyers and someone else has all the sellers. Right. So it's kind of not what it used to be where you had these larger outfits or even the smaller guys where they were able to get both. I think sort of they're siloing a bit.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I'm curious from you. You do a lot of the transactional work, and you work with Sean in our office on a lot of the creative finance transactions. What what has been your sense of the pace in which those deals are still going on? Does it feel like they've slowed some, or still keeping up with the same kind of pace?
I feel like over the summer they kind of slowed down a bit, but I know in like the last week or so, I think we've taken in 3 or 4 new matters to do creative finance work for. So I think everything slows down in the summer here, but I think we are seeing an uptick now.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite for us. For us, summer is when we're blowing and going. It's when we hit the holidays that, everything dies back. And my staff will get a little concerned, right? Because, January, February, there's no closing. You still have other, legal matters, but closings are pretty much gone, other than, of course, your commercial, your developers are always needing to refinance their construction. But I just tell them, look, as long as we pick up by the end of March, we're fine.
Yeah.
And then, these are our busiest months. And then once we hit sort of Thanksgiving, it'll start to taper off. December is always hit or miss, right? It depends on if your lenders have hit their targets. If they haven't hit their targets, everything must close by the end of year, right? If they hit their targets, they're like, oh, I don't want to set next year's, hurdle too high. So, I'll have several deals in January. And that's just kind of how it goes, at least over here in the Southeast.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're just now joining us, this is the Creative Finance Collective, and one of the things that we do, in addition to talk about creative financing, is try to answer any questions that you, the listener, has. So if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We'd be happy to take a look at your questions and do what we can to answer any questions that you do have. Speaking of, let's see. We already got a question. Let's see. Let me see with Jeff here. Jeff, we can we can see you, and it looks like you can hear us, but we can't hear
So I
you.
actually can't see Jeff. I can
Uh,
neither see nor hear him. I just see a black box.
yeah, no, there's just a black box. We can't see him. I stated that incorrect. I meant I can see the black box. I can see your black box, Jeff. We're not the no audio is coming through. That's part of the difficulty. Um, we do have a question. This is a Texas specific question, so I'm just going to go ahead and give the proviso that Drew's already thinking and Libby's already thinking, which is none of us are Texas lawyers, so we have no. And by the way, in any given week, oftentimes we have 2 or 3 Texas lawyers. Last week we had at least 2 Texas lawyers here. Um, Scott Horn is, I think, usually doing his lean seminar on this Wednesday of the month, and Alan Seshker, I don't know what he's up to. Maybe he'll come on. But we can maybe give you some general principles as to your question. So Nick asks, hi, we purchased a rental in Texas subject to, so not a wrap, just a deed. So they didn't do a wrap transaction, just bought it subject to. We have an offer from an investor to pay us cash upfront and take over the sub two. Is this legal, or do we need to do a mirror wrap? Well, so as a general rule, I don't know. I don't know. You would specifically need to talk with the Texas attorney, obviously, about whether you can do that in Texas. In Arizona, I don't know why we prefer to do a mirror wrap when we do a subject to transaction for a variety of reasons. I don't know in principle why, if you didn't do a subject to on the first, whether you would necessarily be required to do on the second. Do you have any thoughts on that, Drew?
Not from Georgia. It's the same thing you were saying. There would be no legal requirement to do so, at least in Georgia. But we can't really speak to Texas's specific requirements. I know the one thing when dealing with Texas is, of course, they have their own title endorsements, and that's always fun to deal with the TLTA instead of Alta.
Yeah, and I can tell you, I'm doubtful that there's a legal requirement that you do it that way. I know one of our Texas guys, Alan Seshker, who does the Wrap University, go check it out if you haven't seen it, is a big proponent of wraps, and for a variety of reasons would want you to do it as a wrap. But I'm not aware, obviously, as not Texas lawyers, don't know that for sure, but in Arizona and sounds like in Georgia, that would not be a legal necessity that you have to do it. Just potentially a prudent one. Let's see. Oh, I see.
You also brought up a really good point. I had a realtor in a closing at the beginning of this week, and she is thinking about getting involved in the wholesale market and the investors market as well. And she was asking me about kind of her commission structure and how she gets paid on assignments and all of that. And she's like, "Is this legal?" And it was exactly to your point was, well, there's nothing illegal, right? But you're going to need to check with your ethics boards, as a licensee or a broker about whether or not it's appropriate. But I can tell you that there's no statutes and there's no, regulations that are going to prevent you from sort of a creative structuring on this. But you're going to need to check with your broker, and you're going to need to check with your real estate board to determine whether or not it's an ethical thing to kind of engage in some of these more far-flung designs on getting paid, whether it's a commission by another name or not.
Jeff, I see you visually now. Can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh man, you're coming in hot now. It sounds good.
You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear
Yes.
you. You're
And
official.
see you.
Yeah.
Praise the Lord. Thank you,
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, so
All right.
So we'll get your take on this now. We've all weighed in on this. So we got a question.
Okay.
It's a Texas-specific question, so I've already told them in any given week we've got Texas lawyers here. This week we don't happen to have any. But let's get your take from Ohio and what this would look like in Ohio. But he says, we purchased a rental subject to, they didn't use a wrap, just a deed. So just a subject to. We have an offer from an investor to pay us cash up front and take over the sub two. Is this legal, or do we need to do a mirror wrap? In other words, do they need to do a mirror wrap is what they're asking. And we don't know as it applies to Texas. How would you handle that in Ohio?
I would handle it one of two ways in Ohio, and then I'll give you a little Texas nugget I picked up. I'm very hesitant to stack my wraps on top of each other. And I'll just use that as a bad colloquialism for this.
Sure.
If they bought it subject to and then they want to go ahead and sell it, then I want to make sure that if they're going off title, then the underlying debt that they bought it subject to is satisfied, paid off, released. Otherwise, I want them to stay on title. And unfortunately, in the state of Texas, the best way to do it is not viable, because I would do that with a land installment contract in Ohio.
Yeah,
now,
you can't do those there.
You can't do it. You can, but no one wants to play by those rules in Texas.
Yeah.
So what I would say in Texas, there is a specific Texas statute. Remember, I'm not licensed in Texas, but I got a few clients down there, that if you're going to wrap, you have to do so with the underlying lender's consent. And I don't know if they've gotten that or not. So then I'll give you one last thing, just in case anybody's wondering regarding a mirror wrap. That's where there's, the payment in is the payment out with no spread for the guy in the middle. And I'm not sure why I would do that deal then.
Yeah. All right. Good thoughts. I like it.
Yeah. Can I go back on something else that we were talking about when I could hear you guys clearly and you couldn't hear me?
Go for it.
And that has to do with wholesaling. Okay.
Okay.
I've got two big comments. Number one, if you haven't read the articles in the progressive publication called ProPublica, where they're targeting wholesalers big time, you need to go read it. Before the first one came out, they were asking me questions. They were asking National RIA questions. I directed them to some other resources. Then the whole article shifted and started going really after home investors instead of after a lot of other people. But that's fine. But I'm going to be flat out with you. If you're listening to this and you should be, you need to decide right now to do one of two things. Become legal, moral, and ethical as a wholesaler, or get out. Because if we keep seeing the slime balls that we've been seeing, slandering title, running around, tying up stuff that they have no ability, no intent to close, we're going to see some national legislation killing wholesaling. It's coming. It's a matter of time. We either got to clean up our act or the government's going to do it to us. The second thing I want to talk about wholesaling is this. If you're a licensed real estate agent, if you're a licensee, agent, broker, realtor, whatever you want to call it, you can wholesale. But remember this one thing. You're going to go ask your broker. Your broker's not going to know what to tell you to do. Just bump it up 3 levels and skip it and go right to your state commissioner or go right to the National Association, the Association of Real Estate Licensed Law Officials, ARELO, and go right to where they are. And that is, they do not want any form of customer confusion. No form of consumer confusion should exist. If you're a licensee and you're wholesaling, you had better disclose multiple times in writing, I am acting as an investor. I am not representing anybody. I am not representing the buyer. I'm not representing the seller. I am the buyer. I'm not representing anybody. You got to say it till you sound like a broken record. You got to put it in writing multiple times in order to make everybody happy. That's the position that I get from my interactions with regulatory agents from multiple states.
One thing I couldn't agree more on, and whether it's wholesaling or creative finance, the first word in your investor vocabulary should be disclosure. Your alphabet should start with D. Like that's what you should be doing, no matter what. And it, we've tried to. Of course, you'd meet with a lawyer and figure out to what extent disclosure requirements are there. But man, just assume you're going to have to disclose and just over disclose.
I agree wholeheartedly on over disclose. Do not try and get sneaky and bury the disclosure language in the middle of some long boilerplate paragraph. Don't do that. Particularly when you're dealing with consumers. And particularly when you're dealing with older consumers. See, if you go back and you look at where's the socially vulnerable population that the progressive community will rally behind and say that we are ripping them off. And it's usually going to be the older, more mature seller who may not hear clearly, who may not understand, and so on. And so make sure it's in really bold, obvious print and go from there. I would rather lose a dozen deals because I over disclosed than do one deal where I didn't disclose enough and then get in trouble for it later on.
Yeah, and one other thing too, one of your other points, if you're a listener, you can go back and check out some of the other creative finance collectives. But it seems like in the last couple weeks, where lawyers on the collective have vented about legal problems or issues that they've seen, where investors aren't even bothering to get legal help, or they're just flying by the seat of their pants, or almost always dealing with wholesaling. Almost always in every one of the cases, usually in assignments or recording, documents and states against property that they don't have any business doing, just to try to, lien or lock up property and whatever else. So there's something about that, which is a shame, because it's a great opportunity to be involved in real estate and go make money when you do it
It
right.
is, but you've got to do it right. You've got to do it right. And I mean, this is where I think that we as a group of lawyers, a collective group of lawyers, can do the whole community a service if we consistently preach the fundamentals of contract law. What is a real valid contract? Where you have a meeting of the minds and the offer and acceptance mirror each other. Yeah, I know I'm sounding like contracts on the first week of first year of law school. Okay, I know, but wholesalers need to hear this. They need to hear this, because if they're entering into a quote contract to buy a property and they don't have the intent, the capacity, or the ambition to actually perform, I don't think it's a valid contract.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a wholesale close yesterday, and well, it's the second one for that day, but the buyer came separate from the sellers, right, as it normally is. And the buyer asked me, he said, "Hey, what happens if I didn't buy?" Right? Because he knows the sellers, and there's a tenant, an occupancy agreement for like a month or whatever. And he's like, these wholesalers, like what would happen if I didn't buy? And fortunately, he's dealing with one of my larger clients, and I said, well, they would take it down. Right, which they do, and I said, and they blacklist you, right? If you didn't actually perform as the C buyer, you totally be blacklisted. He said, well, no, I don't intend to do that. But he said, I'm just trying to figure out, like they don't seem to really have much skin in the game, right? Of course, they paid earnest money as well, and he paid earnest money in on his side of the contract. But these guys are large enough that if the buyer walks, and they obviously can't negotiate extensions to line up the closings again, then they'll just take it down and hold it until they can actually flip it. And I really think that that's obviously the best practice, right? Is to your point, is you should be ready, willing, and able to take down the property if your buyers walk. Now, I understand a lot of folks, they don't do it because they go online, they watch people, they just think they put in earnest money, or they think incorrectly they don't need to put in earnest money because, I mean, what does it matter? Contract said earnest money, but who cares what that thing says?
It's
I know
just
you're
10
talking
bucks.
about.
All I need, $10. $10. I can
I know,
wholesale
right?
with change. I mean, I had a guy get in trouble in Ohio for speaking on stage in front of 3 regulators from the state of Ohio, saying, just with the spare change I can find in my couch cushions, I can tie up a property. And I was like, oh, Lord have mercy. Oh, Lord have mercy. Yeah. So anyhow, yeah, I've been on a rant about wholesaling, just like you guys have been for so long. I mean, when it's done right, it's a beautiful thing. Okay. When it's done wrong, it's a complete disaster.
You talk about done right. I do have to throw this out for one of my guys. This was last fall. They had a really fat spread. It was a 6-figure spread, and they were selling it to a development authority. And the development authority's lawyers obviously had to close it. And so it was like it doesn't really matter if it's an assignment or if it's a double close, because they're going to handle the whole transaction anyway, right? They're going to see what your spread is. And so I asked him, I followed up with him, I said, what happened with that? And he's like, Drew, they didn't care because they already had a developer lined up to, sort of revitalize this area of town. They're like, we didn't care. We sold it for over $1 million, what we paid for it. And so you said, when it works right, it's a beautiful thing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I've talked about this, and we'll move on whenever you guys want to, but I've got clients that I advise on some of the operational issues, And if I added them all together, the guys out of Texas, the guys out of Florida, the guys out of Alabama, the guys out of Ohio, they're buying 3 houses a day on a national basis. I've got another client that runs a massive operation out of Texas with, supplying data to wholesalers all over America. And there's so much good that's happening, but at the same time, it's these, how do I phrase this? It's these wannabes that think that they got to come up with some slick little angle to make them stand out different from doing it the right way in order to get their audience on social media. That's where we really start to go down the wrong path.
Well, why do you think that? Why do you think it's that industry that, and maybe it's all of them, that you're always going to get the wannabes, that get into there. I wonder if the barrier to entry is the wannabes never want to. They're wannabes, but they also don't want to do the work to understand, how to do it right. They want it's make a quick buck. And sometimes I wonder with wholesaling and assignments, the thought is, well, I don't, in a lot of these places, I don't need a real estate license. I can jump in and do this. Maybe if I get a simple assignment form, boy, I look online and you can get an assignment form you can have an effective assignment in a paragraph or two. You don't need a lot of language for that. So maybe there's the perception that this is easy and I can just jump into it. And somebody said I can lock up a property. Well, I'll just go record this document and not worry about the consequences or even think that there are consequences. And you're tying up somebody's real estate. This is a big deal. And on top of that, we were talking about on the NREM podcast yesterday, Sean and I were going through removing liens and judgments on property. And we had a whole segment talking about how easy it is to record things with the county recorder. There's no traffic cop stopping you, at the front door from just filing willy-nilly, whatever the heck that you decide you want to file. And you just affix somebody's legal description to it and have it notarized. You've got to record a document pretty much in just about any county in the country. And that has consequences for people's, or almost always negative consequences for people's real estate. And, so it makes me wonder if just the barrier to entry is perceived as not being as more difficult, as something like creative financing or something else. So it's just the first step that they attempt to get into. I don't know.
Well, I agree with you that the barrier of entry is presented as being way too low. And I clearly, I said that on purpose, with it's being presented as way too low. The barrier to entry is actually higher than what it is described to most people.
Sure.
And you've got to be able to read, you've got to be able to think, you've got to be able to understand, you've got to have some working capital to invest in a good set of documents from a local competent attorney. Because if you just try and do this business with forms that you're going to get from some guru off of YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, you're going to make a mess and you won't even know it. It's like trying to bake a cake without looking at a recipe. How well is that going to turn out?
Yeah. Yeah.
When someone comes to me, I do the same thing. I'm like, look, I have to see your documents first, right? Like, before I agree, I'm going to work with you. I need to know what it is you're putting in front of people. Because again, I mean, sometimes you're right. I don't want to be associated with the documents either, right? I'm like, this does not work. At least in Georgia, it might have worked in whatever state you're from, but it's not going to work here.
Yeah.
Well, and there, I'm sure I know, and I've seen some comments here about some mentioning groups and people that have put together forms. I'm sure that there's good forms out there, but we're dealing with 50 different states with 50 different sets of laws, and they all treat all of these things differently. And the internet has changed so much. We saw this one time with some of our creative financing forms that Sean had worked up here that were Arizona specific, and we got somebody who came to us, and it just happened to come to us because we have an attorney in Georgia who does Arizona and Georgia work. He got referred a client in Georgia to work through forms that he came across. They just happened to be our forms, but they weren't Georgia specific at all. They're all Arizona. They were Arizona specific. And we're like, okay, you got these. Where did you get these? I'm not even sure they found them online or somebody sent them to them, but they were ready to go and sign on the dotted line. We're like, no,
Yeah.
you even if you're going to find somebody who's really put together, some great generic forms, that can never replace having those vetted with somebody local that knows what they're doing.
So
It doesn't mean you have to use our forms, right? I mean, to be honest, especially for the larger guys, the forms they use are, fine. Everyone's got basically the same language. It's just we need to tweak it maybe for Georgia or to make additional disclosures. But most of the forms that I look at, yeah, it'll work, right? I would just recommend that you add this, generally it's a disclosure, right? If you I would disclose a little bit more on, the last right above the signature line. That's generally where I like to put the disclosures, right below what they're signing, so they can't say they didn't see that I'm a wholesaler and I buy and sell for profit, right? I might, only own your property briefly, and this is what I do, and you're okay with it. And also, I'm allowed to market your property.
see, now that's an interesting little twist. In Ohio, we can't put language in a contract that will say we can market your property, because that you can't contractually agree to violate state law. State law in the state of Ohio is if you don't own it, you can't market the property. And I've set this standard very clearly in Ohio. We've taught it a bunch of times. And every real estate agent that takes continuing ed sees a video that I did with the Ohio Division of Real Estate that says if you're a wholesaler and you put a property under contract in Ohio, you can only market the contract. And that means no pictures of the house. That means you can't give out the address and so on when you're doing a general mass solicitation of the deal that you have, because you only have a contract. You don't own the house. Now, on a private communication, you can share a little bit more information, but once again, you can't act like you own the house. That is a big issue that we've worked through in the state of Ohio.
Well,
And
Georgia
it's
is currently
in a lot of
working.
other states as well.
Yeah, Georgia's working through that. They're making changes to the MLS because I'll see in the contracts, and of course, in these cases, the parties are involved. There is actually a listing agent. There's obviously a selling agent, and the selling agent is related to the wholesaler. And they're trying to make changes to the MLS to kind of basically disclose is, yes, we're aware that this other party is still on title, but we're under a binding contract. We have an equitable interest in it, and we're in the process of taking title, basically. And I don't think we've actually reached an outcome on that yet. But I do know that our MLS here in Georgia is tweaking some of the language to make it clearer to potential other agents that are looking at it that, the seller is not the actual vested title owner in the property.
So when we have licensees that are marketing the property or marketing the contract, that makes it a lot easier. Yes, you've got more people that are going to get paid out of the transaction. You got to be aware of that. But then we can include things in the broker's remarks on the MLS that the seller will become the owner of record by closing or prior to closing, which is a great way of saying, hey, the person who's marketing this property right now, that the agent's marketing it for right now, they're in the process of buying it. They've got a valid contractual interest. They may have an equitable interest depending on your state, but they're going to be the owner of record prior to closing. And that solves when you've got agents that are doing that, it solves a ton of problems. But I'm gonna be rude here. We have way too many wholesalers that are too stinking lazy, cheap, or uneducated to use good quality agents to make life better for everybody.
And I think what some of this should illustrate too for the listener, the investor, like Drew was saying, there's a lot of these contracts, the good forms that are put together, whether we're talking about wholesaling or creative financing, they're going to look real similar in a lot of states. 95% of them are going to look similar, but it's not the 95% that kills you. It's the 5% that kills you. That last little bit, because every state's funny. Some states, not only will they require you disclose something, sometimes they want it to actually state the disclosure in an exact manner. They want it to say a certain thing, right? You can't just meet the purpose or the intent of what the statute is getting at. They want you to state something directly. We were talking with Bill Bronchick, Colorado attorney. He was talking about the foreclosure rescue law. That law has criminal penalties to it. And well, one of them, he was joking, but he was serious at the same time. One of the requirements was a font requirement. He was like, and his joke was, "What are you in for?" And he's like, "Murder? No, font." I got the font wrong, so I'm in jail. I mean, but there are but that should illustrate reasons why you need to have a lawyer be looking just to check for the 5%, right? The little bits that make these big form contracts different from the rest.
And this is actually extremely timely because, as Jeff was saying, right, at some point the regulators are going to get involved. And in Alabama, they did, and they passed a new law in May. Jeff, did you see this one yet about the new disclosure that took effect August, like this month?
No, I don't. I can't remember. I don't recall it.
Right. So they did two things. One is I forget the name of that firm that all the title underwriters have been upset with, right? They filed those stupid 40-year service contracts, right? And they tie up the land forever. They outlawed that with the
Good.
$10,000 penalty. But they also, if you are engaged in wholesaling, assignments, or novations, or a similar method of transferring interest in real property, you are now required to disclose to any subsequent purchaser or assignee the nature of your equitable interest, to the seller of the property, the buyer's intent to market this equitable interest prior to commencing any marketing of the property, and to the seller of the property, the effective date of any assignments of your interest to a subsequent purchaser at least 3 days prior to the effective date of any assignment. And then they give more disclosure law. So, I mean, they've codified at this point exactly how and when the disclosures have to be made to all of the parties involved.
Wow.
So yeah, if you want to look it up, it's SB 228, passed in May, effective this month in Alabama.
Yeah, okay, Alabama.
So if you're engaged in this, I mean, they even point out novations by name, assignment, novation, or other similar method. A violation of this section is a Class C misdemeanor, and you're liable, equal to 3 times the fee or amount received by the buyer pursuant to the assignment. So they've got some penalties in there just to give it some bite.
The good old treble damages.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, my.
So, I mean, yeah, you're right. It's that 5% that'll kill you because this is a brand new
Yep.
5%. So people operating in Alabama, you really need to update your contracts.
You do. And I'm glad you brought that to my attention because I'm going to be speaking at a small conference in Huntsville, Alabama next month. And I will make sure that the audience is aware of that and the importance of taking whatever they've been using and going back to their local council and getting it dialed in. And, because I've sold thousands of forms and documents, to multiple people all over the nation. And I always am saying, listen, I can get you first and goal on the 5-yard line. It's that 95%, Andy. I can get you first and goal on the 5-yard line, but you have to use a local attorney to get you into the end zone. And some of them like, yeah, that makes sense. And some are like, oh, you sure I have to? I think I can just do it. Like, okay, I told you.
Yeah, well, and it seems too, when you talk about regulation, thinking about what investor space that you're in real estate, it seems like for a little bit of time, wholesaling has been in the crosshairs of regulators, and I think will continue to be. And I think one of the reasons for that, beyond just maybe what people perceive is bad activity on behalf of investors, but some of it is just realtors feeling like their space is being encroached on, right? So I'm sure there's a good bit of advocacy going on in states to regulate it. I think a lot of the folks with the law that was passed in Arizona a while back dealing with disclosures and wholesaling, the law itself felt rushed. Some of the language was vague, lawyers were like, okay, what does this mean? When are we supposed to do that? Why? This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Kind of felt like it was written by folks that didn't really understand the process that well, but felt like they needed to do something. So there was a little bit of that, but the story is the same, and I think is going to be the same. And you're going to continue to see that for regulators who love to regulate. That's what they do, and they love to do it, and they feel like they're being lazy if they're not regulating. Wholesaling's at the front of their list. more so than creative finance, it feels like. That's for sure.
Oh, it is. Absolutely. It is
Yeah.
at the front of their list. And the thing that motivates a regulator is that they feel like, and they tell themselves that they're protecting consumers. Okay. And let's face it, there are some consumers that need to sell, and their house is in such condition that no listing agent will take it. I mean, when's the last time you saw an MLS listing for a hoarder house that hadn't been cleaned out? So somebody's going to have to buy those properties and take them over. Somebody's going to have to do something with it. Agents aren't going to list them. So you've got to find that balance. And so if you think about it, if you're the wholesaler, if you're the investor, think about it from the perspective of flip it around. What would you, if you were in the consumer shoes, what would you want to be told when you're solving their problem? You want, the first thing that they want is solve their problem and do what you say you're going to do when or before you say you're going to do it. And the number one grievance that I have heard from regulators in Washington, Oregon, Illinois, Kansas, Indiana, and Ohio and Florida is tying up a property and dragging it out and dragging it out and dragging it out and never closing. That is the number one grievance in the Arello community.
Interesting. So I wanted to show you guys some news we've talked about in the past. By the way, if you're just watching and joining us, this is the Creative Finance Collective. This is a collection of lawyers from all over the country. We have at least 4 or 5 states rather. One country, 5 states represented. And we're here to talk about creative finance and things relating to real estate. And you as a listener, we're taking questions throughout the entire hour. So if you have questions, let us know. We'd love to address them. My name, if you're not familiar, I'm Andy Fowler. I'm an Arizona attorney. We've got Elizabeth Best, also an Arizona attorney, Drew Jenkins in Georgia and Alabama, and Jeff Watson in Ohio. So if you have questions, make sure to share them with us. We'd love to engage with you. I have wanted to show you all a couple news articles and get your take on this. I like to try to keep pace with the economy because we're talking about creative finance, and creative finance is an industry that isn't dependent on any one market, but has its popularity right now because of high interest rates and market conditions, right? So I wanted to talk about this. Let me show this to you and read it for you. So this is out of today. Stocks sink as Fed minutes reveal more hikes still on table. Stock market news today. I don't not necessarily looking for a reaction yet, but interesting note. A lot of investors trying to figure out which way the market's going to go. Maybe didn't hear the term "don't fight the Fed." Well, if you're not fighting the Fed, there still may be, or the concern is there might still be more rate hikes to come. So we all know what that means. I want to show you one other article here. There's a little more reading in this, so I'll read this out to you. But 2 interesting paragraphs. The dominance of the 30-year fixed rate mortgage in America is propping up home values. Tons of homeowners scored an incredible deal during the pandemic, a 3% mortgage rate for the remainder of their 30-year loan. Now they're staying put because moving would mean taking on a rate that's twice as high. This means buyers who are in the market now are duking it out for a very small pool of homes, preventing home values from plunging. About 9 in 10 homeowners now have a mortgage with a rate under 6%, which is nearly a full percentage point below today's average rate of 6.96. As a result, just 1% of homes have changed hands this year, the lowest number in at least a decade. The number of homes for sales in the U.S. dropped 15% year over year, the biggest annual decline in nearly 2 years. So the reason I share this, we've talked about the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the market generally. What's it going to do? Where is it going? There's been a consensus that not only there's been a growing interest in creative finance, and what it is and its power and why it's valuable. Boy, when I read articles like this, my first thought is it's not going away anytime soon. It sure doesn't feel like it's going away anytime soon. Now there will be a day when it's not, but we're in somewhat of an unprecedented time. Not that raising interest rates is unprecedented, but followed by a time of unprecedented low interest rates, right? Where we were just almost at zero. And now you've got homeowners sitting on their home and they don't want to sell. And why would they? They've got a great interest rate. And of course, that's basically keeping price from plunging, for the most part. What do you guys with news like this? It feels like the only way forward for the time being is creative finance. Do you see it? Do you see other than those that are just going to sit on their home?
What we're seeing with the builder clients is obviously they're doing buy downs, or they're simply obviously they have lending arms and they're simply holding all of the loans they generate as portfolio loans, right? Because they're under market to try and move their inventory. Obviously, normal people that are moving, unless you're buying new builds, and of course, I think that's why the builders for a while there were still going pretty hot and heavy. I realize that's kind of backed off a little bit as I think as rates have continued where they are, but they were also playing a lot of games to try and convince people to buy, because new homes, as you pointed out, are basically the only game in town. As people are not wanting to lose their monthly payments with their really low interest rates. And as you said, people are going to have to get creative if they just want to sell their home and buy a new one, because otherwise it's just bad economics for them.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of thoughts. I think that we will see, and this I'm going to start micro and then I'm going to get out macro. I think we will see structured or arranged transactions where a party that has, say, a 3% fixed rate 30-year on their house agrees to sell their house on a creative structure only when they know that they're going to acquire another similar house on a creative structure with a similar low rate. I think we'll start seeing a lot of these lined up as dominoes to happen. It's going to take a lot more work. It's going to take a lot more thinking, and that's going to keep all of us in business, and I'm fine with that. That's on the micro scale. On the macro scale, from a big picture perspective, I am deeply concerned about the impact that these current rates and possible future rate hikes are going to have on the overall U.S. economy, because we have a Congress that makes drunken sailors look like spendthrifts. Okay? And so since we're now at the level of about a $2 trillion a year deficit, that keeps piling up, and that's got to be paid for through funding it somehow or another. And the borrowing cost that the federal government is going to have under this interest rate environment, particularly if the Fed bumps it some more, is going to choke the U.S. economy, because it's just the borrowing cost plus Medicare and Social Security are going to take all of the tax revenue. And so I'm concerned about that. And so there may be this engineered rate cut in order for the federal government to refinance a bunch of its debt and not have that problem. We'll see. We live in interesting times.
Yeah. I think Andy pointed out a really good point is we have to remember that the low rates were the abnormality, right? I mean, we're actually back to normal, right, in previous decades.
Yep.
So, assuming that we don't go abnormal again, and this is what it should be in a well-functioning market. Again, no one batted an eye at 7% interest rates in the 80s, 90s, and early aughts, right? Unless you were coming out of a recession. I mean, something has to give somewhere, as you said. The question is, what's going to give first? And I'm not sure that we're going back to zero interest rates again.
Well, it's that you made a great point. we're not really even at historically high interest rates. We're just at historically high recent interest rates.
Yeah.
I was talking with Sean about this the other day, you know, when I reveal my age, but you know, when I bought my first home, which was in the early 2000s, I worked hard to make sure I had good credit, and I did have good credit. I had about as good as you could have. My wife and I did. We bought our first house, and I think it was 6.5, and we were thrilled with the rate. At the time, we were thrilled. We thought it was a great rate, and it was fine for us. But the home price back then was $150,000. You know, the and what we haven't had because of because of Fed engineering. Where we're at is because of Fed engineering, good or bad, because they've turned the economic playing field into a video game. But you know, where we had these cheap interest rates, now we've got these buyers that don't want to sell. Well, when the market would have turned in the past, maybe you would have gotten, a better buying opportunity for investors with lower housing prices. You're just not getting that. So, now we've got high real estate prices coupled with the increased interest rates, which is really the kick in the pants. That's what's really I think killing a lot of folks. Now, what's interesting, I think, Jeff, that you had mentioned, I've kind of wondered when are we going to start seeing the sell my home on a sub 2 deal to go get into a home on a sub 2 deal. And to me, on one hand, that almost has to happen because one of the downsides to the sub 2 deal for the seller is even if everything works out, if you're the common Joe, that loan's still on your books. And the new lender, if you try to go get new financing to buy conventional after that, they're going to be like, well, you still owe X over here, and your loan to value is not what it needs to be. And you need to make twice what you're making to be able to do that. Well, the average Joe who's not an investor can't do that. But step in, go buy something sub 2. Now we're talking. Now we've got something. So I can totally see where you're coming from from that micro perspective, Jeff, where that almost by necessity could start to happen, and people may get better deals than they ever would right now in the conventional market.
Right.
So
And Jeff,
I'm
that
gonna
leads to a really good point, and I'll pick your brain because you're on the more regulatory side as well. Is, obviously some loans like VA, technically they're assumable, right? So do you think that Fannie or Freddie may make adjustments in, what they're willing to buy to allow lenders just to try and get some more velocity in the market, right? Because you can't constantly I mean, obviously they make money on the turnover as well. And with the market kind of freezing up, that they may relax and, be willing to take on assumable mortgages. And then that would basically create, the market that you're talking about.
with the current administration in place and who they've appointed to chair FHFA, I don't see Freddie and Fannie doing that. Freddie and Fannie they have to pay attention to what FHFA says to them, and I don't see that happening. It should happen, but it won't, unfortunately. I'm going to date myself
I
with a
think
little
that would
comment.
help a lot.
It would help a lot. Well, there's a lot of things that if we could get some different policy changes from the administration down, we'd see a lot of different things happening. I'm going to date myself really badly here. I managed somehow or another to dig into and find some of the transactional documents from when my mom and her husband sold their home in Mountain View, California, right there, Silicon Valley, in 1969. And the buyer, who was represented by an agent, stepped into their existing loan that the local bank held and was perfectly happy with doing it. So one of the things that we're going to have to think about is, with the way that we have now securitized mortgages and turned them into international financing tools, is that good or bad for the creative investing subject to strategy? And I can see pros and cons with that. But if I was a local banker, I just want someone to keep making the payments current. But if I'm just processing paperwork, I really don't care, do I?
No.
Because if it's a portfolio, I care. If I've just passed it on and took my little piece of the pie as I passed it on, then I don't care what happens later on. And that's why we got into the 2008 through 12 meltdown, is because it was, somebody else's problem, not mine.
Right. We've
And you
got
made a great point that people don't believe me about, is you talk about the local bank. I have had local banks turn a blind eye to sub-twos. Right. Like I actually have an email from a loan officer and he was like, thanks for letting me know. Right. Just keep making payments. Like the local banks, you're right. They just want to get paid. They realize it's a flip. They're not going to make a fuss because they know that, the buyer's going to be out of it in, 3 to 6 months anyway.
Right.
So
Right.
the local folks are always easier to deal with than the giant national servicers that a human probably won't even see the email. Right. And then Andy, I think you see there's a question in there from somebody as well on the Facebook side.
Yeah, so we've got a question kind of on point, or headed this direction where we're going here, but it says, Facebook user, with interest rates rising, are you seeing more due on sale clauses being enforced in a sub 2? Is there a way to avoid it? I'll just start and say I haven't seen, interest rates have been rising for a little bit. And I haven't seen any. It's still a rare occurrence, and not been. I haven't seen any trend or increase in like a rate of lenders calling due on sale clauses. What do you guys think?
The two that I saw last month, two investors in two different states had loans being called that they'd taken sub 2, and it had nothing to do with the interest rates. It had everything to do with how they did the deal. One of them had taken it sub 2 right after loan mod, and then when they were fully processing the loan mod and they checked title, they saw, wait a second, the person who signed the loan mod docs is no longer on title. We got a problem. And I screamed, don't do that a year ago. And, now they're finally hearing me. And then the other one was they just completely handled the insurance change totally wrong. And FHFA, it was an FHFA loan. And I say, hey, don't do an FHA loan. I want to be clear. It was an FHA loan. And I said, don't do them. But they went ahead and did it anyhow. And then they screwed up how they handled the insurance switch. And that caused the letter to come from the bank going, hey, if you don't deed it back, we're going to foreclose. You got 30 days. So it had nothing to do with interest rates. It had everything to do with how the transaction was facilitated and done.
On the loan modification deal, was that a loan modification because they had been in default of the payments and had to work it out after the fact? So it was already like a troubled loan, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And that's going to, once it's a troubled loan, the servicer's paying more attention to it because servicing agreements allow them to make a little more money that way. So they're going to massage that to make as much money as they can. And so then when they're going through the process of making sure that the modification is done and recorded, that's when they saw there's their problem. And
right.
So, but once again, to the question from the Facebook user, neither of these had anything to do with interest rates.
Right. What about you, Drew? Have you seen any change in any sort of frequency or heard stories on your side of the country?
No, not that I've heard. As y'all know, I tend to do less sub 2s. I'll only generally do them for my clients that fully recognize the risk profile of what they're doing and fully explain it to their sellers. Because to Jeff's point earlier, there's plenty of folks that watch your YouTube videos and are like, I'm going to buy sub 2. And they think that's going to be covered by their title policy. It's like, you have no idea what you're doing. We are not doing, I am not going to help you engage in this. But no, for my sophisticated guys that do that kind of stuff, there's no change. And again, they're not holding you for any length of time. They're in and they're out.
Yeah.
It's a rehab and then they sell it and everything gets paid off and it's good.
Yeah. I think, people definitely need to understand, especially with that loan modification, when a loan becomes non-performing, it goes into a different basket and office at the bank. It's in the basket you don't want it to be in, where they are paying attention and doing.
You've got to get it out of that basket, and it's got to stay out of that basket for a good 6 to 9 months before you think about doing anything creative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, guys, hey, you've been kind enough to be with us for an hour. We really appreciate it. It was a good discussion. And look forward to doing it with you all again. You guys got any big speaking engagements you're doing you want to promote or anything?
I'm doing
So
a virtual presentation on Saturday, 4 hours plus on subject 2 in conjunction with a RIA out of Kansas City, Missouri. And it's virtual. It's $69. The RIA collects it. You got to go to their website and sign up for it. If you're interested, great. Find me on Facebook. You'll see the links in some of my posts on Facebook. Look for me in the Real Estate Investor Network run by my good friend Jim Ingersoll. It's posted in there. That's a way to find what I'm talking about Subto on Saturday.
All right. What about you, Drew?
So it's not me, but a really good friend of mine, and he's taken me with him. Lawrence is one of the featured panelists at the Captivate conference for the debt funds. It's kind of like the hard money lender folks in Vegas next week and weekend, and so I will be there with him at that conference, and he'll be one of the panelists on navigating debt fund structure. So that should be a lot of fun. So it's
Cool.
creative, but not creative at the buyer seller level. It's creative at the lender level.
Yeah.
So
All right. Well, hey guys, thanks for being with us. Look forward to doing it with you again.
All right.
All right. We'll
Glad
talk
I
to you
got the
soon.
Thanks so
technical
much.
work.
Yeah, we were
Peace.
glad to have you.
All right. Peace.